I woke up that Tuesday morning to find my bird feeders missing from my backyard. And standing on my lawn was a woman in a pantsuit holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. My name is Ryan Fitzgerald, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook subdivision in Boulder, Colorado for 3 years without any major problems. Sure, the HOA sent out annoying newsletters about keeping grass at regulation height and not parking RVs on the street, but I mostly stayed under their radar. I worked from home as a software developer, kept to myself, and enjoyed watching the birds that visited my carefully curated backyard habitat. That morning, everything changed. I grabbed my coffee and walked outside in my pajama pants and old college sweatshirt. The woman on my lawn was middle-aged with that particular haircut that screamed entitlement, perfectly styled in blonde layers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Can I help you?" I called out, noticing that my 3 bird feeders were nowhere to be seen. The thistle feeder I had hung for the goldfinches, the suet cage for the woodpeckers, and my prized tube feeder that attracted everyone from chickadees to nuthatches had all vanished. "Mr. Fitzgerald." She turned to face me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I am Brenda Morrison, president of the Meadowbrook HOA board. I am here to inform you that we have removed your unauthorized bird feeding stations." "You did what?" I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing, my heart rate picking up. "Those were not cheap. You cannot just take someone's property. According to Section 7, Subsection 12 of your HOA agreement, any structures or installations that attract pests or vermin to the community are strictly prohibited." She tapped her clipboard with a manicured nail. "Your bird feeders were creating a nuisance. Pests, they are birds, native birds. This is Colorado, we have birds. We have received numerous complaints from your neighbors about increased rodent activity, bird droppings on vehicles, and unsanitary conditions." Brenda's voice took on that condescending tone I would come to know well over the following weeks. "The board voted unanimously to have them removed. You will receive a formal letter in the mail outlining the violation and the associated fine of $500. $500. For bird feeders." I took a step forward, trying to keep my anger in check. "Where are they? I want them back. The feeders have been disposed of as they were considered a community health hazard." She made a notation on her clipboard. "Any attempt to reinstall bird feeding devices will result in additional fines of $1,000 per occurrence. Have a nice day, Mr. Fitzgerald." She walked away before I could respond, climbing into a white Mercedes SUV parked at the curb. I stood there in my bare feet on the cold grass, watching her drive away, trying to process what had just happened. 3 years of building up a backyard bird sanctuary. Dozens of hours researching the best native plants to attract local species, and hundreds of dollars in feeders and supplies. All gone because Brenda Morrison decided birds were pests. I went back inside and immediately pulled up my HOA agreement on my laptop. I had signed it when I bought the house, barely glancing at the dense legal language because I was just excited to be a homeowner. Now, I read through every word of Section 7, Subsection 12. It was vague, mentioning that homeowners could not maintain anything that attracted vermin or created unsanitary conditions, but there was no specific mention of bird feeders. The language could be interpreted a dozen different ways. My phone rang. It was my neighbor, Tom Bradley, a retired accountant who lived 2 houses down. "Ryan, I saw Brenda at your place this morning. What happened?" She took my bird feeders, said they were attracting pests. Tom sighed heavily. "I was afraid of that. She has been on a rampage lately." Last month, she fined the Hendersons $300 because their daughter drew a hopscotch grid on their driveway with chalk. Said it was graffiti. That is insane. Welcome to life under Brenda Morrison. She became president 6 months ago and has been flexing her authority ever since. My advice: pay the fine and move on. Fighting the HOA is like fighting City Hall, but worse because these people are your neighbors. I thanked Tom and hung up, but I had no intention of just paying the fine and forgetting about it. I had done nothing wrong. Bird feeding was a legitimate hobby enjoyed by millions of Americans. It was not my fault if some mice or squirrels occasionally benefited from the fallen seeds. That was nature. Over the next few days, I started documenting everything. I took photos of my backyard, noting the native plants I had installed specifically to support local bird populations. I had 3 different species of coneflowers, native grasses, serviceberry bushes, and a small water feature that I kept clean and fresh. My yard was a certified wildlife habitat through the National Wildlife Federation. I had the sign to prove it, mounted on a small post near my patio. The formal letter from the HOA arrived on Friday. It was even worse than I expected. According to Brenda's detailed complaint, my bird feeders had attracted rats, raccoons, and skunks to the neighborhood. Several neighbors had apparently reported seeing these animals near my property. The letter demanded payment of $500 within 30 days or face legal action and potential liens on my property. I knew the rat claim was garbage. I had lived here for 3 years and never seen a rat anywhere near my house. Squirrels, yes, the occasional rabbit, sure, but rats. That was Brenda embellishing to make her case stronger. That weekend, I decided to fight back. I started researching HOA law in Colorado and discovered that HOAs had to follow their own bylaws and could not create arbitrary rules without proper procedures. I also found several cases where HOA overreach had been successfully challenged in court. It would be expensive and time-consuming, but I was not going to let Brenda Morrison bully me. On Monday morning, I received an unexpected email. It was from Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher with the Audubon Society's Rocky Mountain chapter. She had somehow heard about my situation and wanted to meet with me to discuss my backyard habitat. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Boulder that afternoon. Dr. Chen was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses. She carried a worn leather messenger bag stuffed with papers and field notebooks. "Mr. Fitzgerald, thank you for meeting with me on short notice," she said as we sat down with our drinks. "I have been looking for residential properties in the Boulder area to study native bird populations and their relationship with urban development. Your neighbor, Tom Bradley, actually contacted me. He is a volunteer bird counter for our Christmas bird count and thought your situation might interest me. Tom called you. I had no idea he was involved with the Audubon Society. He did. He told me about your habitat and the HOA situation. I looked up your property on our satellite mapping system, and I have to say, your backyard is impressive. You have created an excellent native plant community in a suburban setting." She pulled out a tablet and showed me aerial images of my neighborhood. My yard stood out as a green oasis among the typical manicured lawns. "I would like to use your property as part of our urban bird research project. What would that involve?" We would install motion-activated cameras and acoustic monitoring equipment to document which species are using your habitat and how they interact with the environment. The study would run for at least 6 months, possibly longer. We would provide you with all the equipment and data, and your property would be included in our published research. It would essentially prove that your backyard is providing valuable ecological services to native bird populations. I could see where this was going. And that data would help me fight the HOA. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. That is not the primary purpose of our research, but yes, having documented evidence from a respected scientific organization showing that your property supports native wildlife could be very useful if this becomes a legal matter. I agreed immediately. We set up an appointment for the following week to install the equipment. Dr. Chen also gave me the contact information for several other homeowners who had successfully fought HOA restrictions on wildlife-friendly landscaping. One case in Fort Collins had set a precedent that HOAs could not prohibit native plants or wildlife features that provided ecological benefits. That evening, I received a knock on my door. It was my next-door neighbor, Patricia Lewis. She was in her 60s, a retired teacher who had always been friendly when we ran into each other getting mail or taking out trash. "Ryan, I need to talk to you," she said, looking uncomfortable. "Can I come in?" I invited her into my living room. She sat on the edge of my couch, wringing her hands. "I need to apologize," she began. "Brenda came to my house last week and asked me to sign a complaint about your bird feeders. She had this whole speech prepared about property values and health hazards." I signed it without really thinking about it. I did not realize she was going to take your feeders away and fine you. "You signed a complaint." I felt betrayed, even though Patricia and I were not close friends. "I know, I am sorry." She made it sound so reasonable at the time. She had 5 or 6 of us in my living room, talking about community standards and keeping the neighborhood nice. But then, I saw her take your feeders, and Tom told me how much work you have put into your backyard. I felt terrible. Patricia looked up at me with genuine remorse. I wrote a letter to the HOA board retracting my complaint. I do not know if it will help, but I wanted you to know that I do not actually have a problem with your bird feeders. Your yard is lovely. Thank you, Patricia. That means a lot. I felt some of my anger dissipate. Can I ask who else signed the complaint? She listed 4 other neighbors, including Martin and Susan Crawford, who lived across the street and had always seemed cold toward me. Apparently, they were friends with Brenda and supported her strict interpretation of HOA rules. The others were people I barely knew, residents who lived far enough away that my bird feeders could not possibly affect them. After Patricia left, I felt more determined than ever to fight this. Brenda had manipulated my neighbors into supporting her crusade against my bird feeders. She had manufactured a crisis where none existed. The next week, Dr. Chen and her team arrived with their equipment. They installed 3 motion-activated cameras in weatherproof boxes mounted on poles at strategic locations around my yard. They also set up 2 acoustic monitoring stations that would record bird songs and calls 24 hours a day. The equipment was surprisingly unobtrusive, designed to blend in with the natural environment. "We will start collecting data immediately, Dr. Chen explained as her team finished the installation. "I will check in weekly to download data and make sure everything is functioning properly. In a few weeks, we should have enough observations to identify which species are regularly using your habitat." "How long before you would have enough data for a report?" "For a preliminary report, I would say 6 to 8 weeks. For a comprehensive study, we would want at least 6 months of data to capture seasonal variations." She adjusted one of the cameras, checking its angle. "But if you need something sooner for legal purposes, I can provide an initial assessment and documentation of our research presence on your property. That alone might give your HOA pause." The following morning, I received another visit from Brenda Morrison. She arrived with a man I did not recognize, someone in his 30s wearing a cheap suit and carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Fitzgerald, this is Derek Hammond, the HOA's legal counsel," Brenda announced from my driveway. I had not even invited them onto my property this time. "We are here to discuss your non-compliance with the HOA violation notice." "I have not been non-compliant. You gave me 30 days to pay the fine. It has been less than 2 weeks. Derek Hammond stepped forward, trying to look authoritative. "Mr. Fitzgerald, we have become aware that you have installed additional equipment in your backyard. This appears to be an escalation of the original violation." So someone had already reported the Audubon Society cameras, probably the Crawfords. Their house had a clear view of my backyard. "That equipment belongs to the Audubon Society. They are conducting scientific research on native bird populations. My property is part of an official study." I pulled out my phone and showed them the email from Dr. Chen with the official Audubon Society letterhead. "I am participating in conservation research, which is protected under Colorado's right to wildlife laws." I was bluffing a bit on the legal specifics, but it sounded good. Brenda's face tightened. "That does not change the fact that you are still in violation of HOA regulations," she said. "Show me the specific regulation that prohibits bird feeders, not the vague language about pests, but a specific mention of bird feeders." I had done my homework, because I have read the HOA bylaws from front to back, and bird feeders are never mentioned. Derek Hammond flipped through some papers in his briefcase. "The board has the authority to interpret regulations as they see fit for the good of the community. The board has to follow proper procedures for new interpretations. Did you hold a proper vote with notice to all homeowners? Did you allow for public comment?" I was quoting from the Colorado HOA laws I had been studying. Because if you are creating a new rule that specifically bans bird feeders, that requires proper notification and voting procedures. Brenda and Derek exchanged a look. They had not expected me to actually know anything about HOA law. "You will be hearing from us," Brenda said curtly, and they left. I immediately called the lawyer whose contact information Dr. Chen had given me. Her name was Rachel Hoffman, and she specialized in HOA disputes and environmental law. Her office was in Denver, about 40 minutes away. We met 2 days later. Rachel was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her office walls were covered with framed photos of natural landscapes and what looked like various legal awards. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a legal pad. I walked her through the entire situation, from Brenda taking my feeders to the Audubon Society research project. I showed her all the documentation I had gathered, the HOA bylaws, the violation letter, the complaint signatures, and the emails from Dr. Chen. Rachel listened carefully, taking occasional notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You have a strong case," she said. "Colorado has been moving toward more wildlife-friendly laws in recent years. There is precedent for homeowners maintaining native habitats, despite HOA objections. The fact that you have the Audubon Society actively researching your property is excellent. It establishes scientific legitimacy." What are my options? You can fight this administratively through the HOA's own dispute resolution process, or you can take it to court. Administrative is cheaper but slower, and you are at the mercy of the board. Court is faster but expensive, probably $15,000 to $20,000 if it goes all the way to trial. I winced at the number. That was a lot of money. However, Rachel continued, most of these cases settle before trial. Once the HOA realizes you have good legal representation and a strong case, they usually back down. They do not want to spend money on legal fees either, and they definitely do not want the publicity of losing a case about banning bird feeders. It makes them look ridiculous. So what do I do? Let me send them a letter. I will outline your legal position, mention the Audubon Society research, and cite the relevant Colorado statutes. I will request that they rescind the fine and allow you to reinstall your bird feeders. If they refuse, we will file a lawsuit. Rachel's letter went out the next day. I paid her a retainer of $3,000, which hurt my savings account but felt necessary. While waiting for the HOA's response, I focused on the research project. Dr. Chen came by every few days to check the equipment and download data. After 3 weeks, she showed me the preliminary results. "This is remarkable," she said, scrolling through images on her laptop. "We have documented 18 different bird species using your habitat so far. That includes several species of concern like the lazuli bunting and the black-headed grosbeak. Your backyard is providing crucial stopover habitat for migratory birds." The photos were stunning. The motion-activated cameras had captured close-up images of birds I'd seen at my feeders, but never with this kind of detail. There were shots of evening grosbeaks, pine siskins, and a particularly beautiful image of a male western tanager perched on my serviceberry bush. "What about the pest claims?" I asked. "Have the cameras caught any rats or nuisance animals? We have recorded 1 opossum, 3 raccoons, and multiple squirrels over 3 weeks of monitoring. The raccoons appeared briefly at night and moved on. They were not feeding or nesting on your property, just passing through. That is completely normal wildlife activity for this area. We have detected 0 rats. Can you document that in a report?" "Absolutely. I was planning to anyway, but I can emphasize those findings if it helps your case." 2 weeks after Rachel sent her letter, I received the HOA's response. They refused to rescind the fine or change their position. The letter from Derek Hammond was condescending, stating that the board's decision was final and that I should focus on complying with community standards rather than pursuing frivolous legal action. Rachel filed a lawsuit the next day in Boulder County District Court. The case was Ryan Fitzgerald v. Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. We were suing to invalidate the fine, recover the cost of my seized bird feeders, and establish my right to maintain wildlife feeding stations on my property. The lawsuit made the local news. A reporter from the Boulder Daily Camera called me for an interview. And suddenly, my HOA dispute was a human interest story. The article ran with the headline, "Homeowner Battles HOA Over Bird Feeders. Audubon Society Backs His Case." The online version went viral on social media, with hundreds of people commenting about their own HOA horror stories. The publicity changed everything. Suddenly, I was not just a guy fighting with his HOA. I was a symbol of the larger battle between individual property rights and HOA overreach. Environmental groups started sharing the article. Bird watchers across Colorado expressed support. Someone even started a GoFundMe to help with my legal expenses, which raised almost $10,000 in a week. Brenda Morrison was furious. She sent an email to all Meadowbrook residents stating that the media coverage was inaccurate and that the HOA was simply enforcing reasonable community standards. She accused me of damaging the neighborhood's reputation and property values. Her email backfired spectacularly. Several neighbors responded with their own emails supporting me. Tom Bradley wrote a lengthy message explaining the ecological importance of bird-friendly habitats. Patricia Lewis publicly stated that she had been pressured into signing the original complaint. Even some people I did not know came forward to criticize Brenda's authoritarian management style. the HOA held an emergency board meeting, which I attended along with about 30 other residents. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. The board sat at a table facing rows of folding chairs packed with residents. Brenda called the meeting to order, looking frazzled. The other board members included Martin Crawford, the neighbor who had signed the original complaint against me, and two others I recognized but did not know well. Jennifer Wung, a lawyer who had always seemed reasonable, and Robert Thorne, a retiree who rarely spoke at meetings. "We are here to discuss the ongoing situation with Mr. Fitzgerald," Brenda began. "As you are all aware, there has been significant media attention that has unfortunately mischaracterized this board's actions. Maybe because your actions deserve to be criticized," someone called out from the audience. Several people laughed. Brenda's face reddened. "We are simply trying to maintain property values and community standards." Tom Bradley stood up. "Brenda, I have lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. Our property values are not determined by whether someone has bird feeders. They are determined by location, schools, and the overall quality of the community. You are creating division where none existed before." "Bird feeders attract vermin," Martin Crawford interjected. "We have documented evidence of pest problems." "No, you do not," I said, standing up. "The Audubon Society has been monitoring my property with scientific equipment for over a month. They have found zero evidence of rat activity. I have the data to prove it." Jennifer Wung, the lawyer on the board, leaned forward. "Mr. Fitzgerald, can you provide that data to the board? My attorney has already submitted it as part of the discovery process in our lawsuit, but yes, I can share it with you." I pulled out copies of Dr. Chen's preliminary report and passed them to the board members. Jennifer read through the report carefully while the audience waited. After a few minutes, she looked up at Brenda. "This is pretty conclusive. There is no pest problem. And the report indicates that Mr. Fitzgerald's property is supporting native bird populations that are declining in other areas. That seems like a community benefit, not a problem." "The board already voted on this matter," Brenda insisted. "The board can vote again," Jennifer replied. "In fact, given this new evidence, I think we should reconsider our position before this lawsuit costs the HOA tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees." "I agree," Robert Thorne said quietly. It was the first time I had heard him speak. "I never thought bird feeders were a problem to begin with." I voted yes on the removal because Brenda said we had complaints about rats. If that was not accurate, then we made our decision based on false information. Brenda looked panicked. She was losing control of her own board. Martin Crawford tried to support her. "We cannot just back down because of some media pressure. That sets a terrible precedent." "The terrible precedent is the HOA seizing a homeowner's property without proper cause," Tom Bradley called out. More people voiced their agreement. The meeting devolved into arguments, with various residents standing up to share their opinions. Most of the comments supported me, though a few people sided with Brenda, mainly older residents who believed strongly in strict HOA enforcement. Finally, Jennifer Wung made a motion to hold a formal board vote on rescinding the fine and allowing me to reinstall my bird feeders. Robert Thorne seconded. Martin Crawford and Brenda both voted no, but Jennifer and Robert voted yes. The motion passed 2-1 with one abstention. I could hardly believe it. After weeks of stress and thousands of dollars in legal fees, the HOA had backed down, but Brenda was not done. As people started filing out of the meeting, she stood up and announced her intention to call for a special election to add 2 more board members who would support proper enforcement of community standards. She was trying to pack the board with her allies to overturn the decision. Rachel advised me to let the political process play out. "You won this round," she said over the phone that night. "The fine is rescinded and you can put your feeders back up. If Brenda wants to waste more time and money trying to change the board composition, that is her choice." But most homeowners are not going to support her after this debacle. The next morning, I went to a local wild bird supply store and bought new bird feeders to replace the ones the HOA had destroyed. I installed them in the same locations, along with a new suet feeder and a Niger seed feeder. Within hours, the birds were back: chickadees, nuthatches, finches, and juncos. It felt like a victory. Dr. Chen stopped by a few days later to check on the monitoring equipment. She had heard about the board meeting. "Congratulations on your win," she said. "This is good for conservation efforts across the state. The more precedents we can set for wildlife-friendly residential properties, the better." "How is the research going?" "Excellent. We have now documented 23 species using your habitat. The acoustic monitors are picking up species we have not even photographed yet. This is turning into one of our most successful urban wildlife studies." She pulled out her tablet to show me graphs of bird activity over time. "We are seeing clear patterns of increased species diversity compared to neighboring properties without native plants or feeding stations." "Will you publish the results?" "Definitely. This will be part of a larger study on urban bird populations in Colorado. Your property will be featured as an example of successful suburban habitat creation." Over the following weeks, life slowly returned to normal. I continued working from home, watching birds at my feeders during breaks between video conferences and coding sessions. The Audubon Society's cameras kept recording data. Tom Bradley stopped by occasionally to talk about birds and share updates on neighborhood politics. The special election Brenda called for happened in late spring. She had recruited 2 candidates who supported her strict enforcement philosophy, but several other residents also ran for the board positions, including Patricia Lewis. The election turned into a referendum on Brenda's leadership style. Patricia won one of the open seats. The other went to a younger resident named Michael Torres, who had recently moved to the neighborhood and believed HOAs should focus on maintaining common areas rather than micromanaging individual properties. With these new board members, Brenda no longer had any allies. Jennifer Wang became the de facto leader of the board, and they quickly moved to revise several of the more restrictive HOA rules. But Brenda still had not learned her lesson. In June, I received a new violation notice. This time, she claimed my native plant landscaping was unkempt and violated aesthetic standards. She demanded I remove my prairie grasses and wildflowers and replace them with traditional turf grass. I was furious. This was pure retaliation. I called Rachel immediately. "She is not going to stop," I said. "What can I do?" "Sue her personally for harassment," Rachel replied. "We have a pattern of behavior now. She lost the bird feeder fight and now she is coming after you for something else that is clearly related to native wildlife habitat." We can make a case for targeted harassment. Before we could file anything, however, Jennifer Wang called me. "Ryan, I need to tell you something confidentially," she said. "The board just received a complaint about Brenda. Apparently, she has been using HOA funds inappropriately. One of the residents is an accountant and noticed irregularities in the financial reports." "What kind of irregularities?" "Significant ones. She has been reimbursing herself for expenses that do not appear to be legitimate HOA business. We are talking about several $1,000s over the past 6 months. The board hired a forensic accountant to audit the HOA's finances. What they found was shocking. Brenda had been using the HOA credit card for personal expenses, dinners at expensive restaurants, shopping trips, spa treatments. She had disguised them as board business expenses or community outreach costs. In total, she had embezzled over $15,000 from the HOA's funds. The board held another emergency meeting. This time, Brenda was not running it. She sat in the audience, looking pale and defensive. Jennifer Wong presided over the meeting. Based on the auditor's report, we have evidence of financial misconduct by our former president, Jennifer announced. The word former was pointed. The board has voted unanimously to remove Brenda Morrison from her position and to refer this matter to the Boulder Police Department for investigation. The room erupted in shocked conversations. Brenda stood up, trying to defend herself. This is a witch hunt. Those expenses were all legitimate. If there were some mistakes in the documentation, that is not a crime. $15,000 in mistakes. Robert Thorne shook his head. Brenda, you charged a weekend spa retreat to the HOA as a board planning session. You claimed dinners at Flagstaff House as community meetings. There is no documentation showing any other board members were even present. 2 police officers were waiting outside the meeting room. Jennifer had notified them in advance. They came in and spoke with Brenda, and while they did not arrest her on the spot, they made it clear she would need to come to the station for questioning. I felt an odd mixture of vindication and sympathy. Brenda had made my life miserable over bird feeders, but watching her face the consequences of actual criminal behavior was not satisfying in the way I had imagined. It was just sad. The legal process moved slowly over the summer. Brenda was eventually charged with theft and embezzlement. She tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the district attorney's office was not particularly lenient. She ended up pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud and theft. In September, she was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, and required to perform 300 hours of community service. The judge's comments during sentencing were pointed. You were entrusted with managing your community's resources, and you betrayed that trust for personal gain. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of theft over many months. Meanwhile, the Audubon Society's research project concluded successfully. Dr. Chen's team published their findings in a regional conservation journal. My property was featured prominently, with detailed data showing how residential bird-friendly landscaping could support native species in urban and suburban environments. The study found that my backyard had hosted 31 different bird species over 6 months, including several species that were declining in the region. Dr. Chen organized a small celebration at my house when the article was published. She invited several other researchers and local birding enthusiasts. We stood in my backyard, drinking wine and watching evening grosbeaks at the feeders while she explained the study's significance. This research has real implications for conservation policy, she said. We can now show municipalities and HOAs that native landscaping and bird-friendly features are not just aesthetic choices, but provide measurable ecological benefits. Your fight with your HOA helped make this research possible. Tom Bradley raised his glass. To Ryan, for having the courage to stand up for what was right. Everyone toasted. I felt embarrassed but also proud. What had started as a frustrating dispute over bird feeders had turned into something larger and more meaningful. The new HOA board, led by Jennifer Wong with Patricia Lewis and Michael Torres, revised the community's bylaws over the following months. They added specific language protecting native landscaping and wildlife habitat features. They also implemented better financial controls and transparency measures to prevent the kind of abuse Brenda had perpetrated. I was invited to serve on a new community beautification and environmental committee that the board created. At first, I was hesitant, given my history with the HOA, but Jennifer convinced me to participate. "We need people who actually care about these issues," she said. "Not just people who want to enforce rules for the sake of enforcing rules." The committee ended up being productive and even enjoyable. We worked on improving the common areas with native plants, installing community bird feeders near the walking trails, and creating educational signage about local wildlife. Several other homeowners in the neighborhood started creating their own bird-friendly habitats after seeing the positive attention my yard received. In October, Tom Bradley organized a neighborhood bird walk as part of the committee's outreach efforts. About 20 residents showed up, including several families with children. I led the group through the neighborhood, pointing out different species and explaining how various plants and features attracted birds. We ended at my backyard, where Dr. Chen had temporarily set up some of the research equipment to show people how the monitoring worked. One of the kids, a girl about 10 years old, was fascinated by the motion-activated cameras. "Can we get these at our house?" she asked her parents. Her mother smiled. "We can definitely put up some bird feeders and see what shows up." That moment made everything worthwhile. The months of stress, the legal fees, the conflict with Brenda, all of it had led to something positive. The neighborhood was becoming more environmentally conscious, more connected to the natural world. In December, I attended the annual HOA meeting. It was nothing like the contentious emergency meetings from earlier in the year. Jennifer Wang presented a year-end report showing that the HOA's finances were stable and properly managed. Michael Torres discussed upcoming improvements to the common areas. Patricia Lewis talked about the success of the Environmental Committee and our plans for the next year. When Jennifer opened the floor for questions and comments, several residents expressed appreciation for the board's new direction. One woman thanked them for moving away from the nitpicky enforcement that had characterized Brenda's tenure. Another resident suggested expanding the bird-friendly initiatives to include bat boxes and pollinator gardens. As I sat there listening, I reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. My simple desire to feed birds and create a backyard habitat had sparked a conflict that revealed deeper problems within the community. Brenda's authoritarian management style and financial crimes had gone unnoticed until someone stood up to challenge her authority. If I had just paid the fine and taken down my feeders, who knows how long her misconduct would have continued. The meeting ended with refreshments and socializing. I found myself talking to neighbors I had barely known before this whole situation started. We discussed birds, gardening, and community improvement projects. The Crawfords, who had been some of Brenda's staunchest supporters, even apologized to me for their role in the original complaint. "We were wrong," Martin Crawford admitted. "Brenda had us convinced that your bird feeders were causing problems. We did not bother to verify her claims." "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. It felt good to clear the air. As winter settled in, my bird feeders became even more important for the local bird populations. Colorado winters could be harsh, and reliable food sources helped birds survive the cold months. I kept the feeders filled with high-quality seed and made sure the suet cages stayed stocked. On particularly cold mornings, I would stand at my kitchen window with my coffee, watching chickadees and nuthatches brave the freezing temperatures to grab seeds. The Audubon Society asked if they could continue using my property for long-term monitoring. Dr. Chen wanted to study how bird populations changed across seasons and over multiple years. I agreed immediately. The cameras and acoustic monitors had become part of the landscape, and I enjoyed receiving the quarterly reports showing which species had been detected. In January, I received an unexpected invitation. The Colorado Native Plant Society wanted me to speak at their annual conference about creating wildlife habitat in HOA-governed communities. They had read about my case and thought my experience would be valuable for other homeowners facing similar challenges. I accepted the invitation nervously. Public speaking was not my strength, and I was just a software developer who liked birds, not an environmental expert. But when I stood at the podium in front of about 100 conference attendees in Denver, I found that I had a lot to say. I talked about my journey from installing bird feeders to fighting the HOA, from nearly giving up to finding allies in the Audubon Society and supportive neighbors. I explained how scientific research had provided the evidence needed to counter the HOA's claims about pests. I shared the lessons I had learned about HOA law and the importance of standing up for what you believe in. The thing about HOAs, I said, wrapping up my talk, is that they are only as good or bad as the people running them. They have legitimate purposes in maintaining common areas and protecting property values. But they can also become vehicles for petty tyranny if no one pushes back against overreach. If you are facing an unreasonable HOA restriction, do your homework, find allies, get expert help if you can, and do not be afraid to stand your ground when you know you are right. The audience applauded. Several people came up afterward to share their own HOA stories and ask for advice. I gave them Rachel Hoffman's contact information and suggested reaching out to local conservation organizations for support. Dr. Chen was in the audience. She approached me after the crowd had dispersed. "That was excellent," she said. "You know, we are always looking for volunteers to help with community outreach and education. Have you ever considered getting more involved with the Audubon Society?" I had not, but the idea appealed to me. Over the following months, I became a regular volunteer, helping with bird counts, leading nature walks, and assisting with educational programs. It was fulfilling in a way my day job never had been. Software development paid the bills, but helping people connect with nature felt like more meaningful work. By spring, my life had found a new equilibrium. The bird feeders were busy with migratory species passing through Colorado on their way north. The native plants in my yard were coming back to life after the winter dormancy. The HOA was functioning smoothly under Jennifer Wang's leadership, focused on actual community needs rather than arbitrary rule enforcement. I sometimes thought about Brenda Morrison and wondered how she was doing. I had heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved out of Meadowbrook, unable to face the community after her conviction. I felt a pang of sympathy, despite everything she had put me through. Her downfall had been her own doing, but it was still a cautionary tale about how power, even in something as small as an HOA board, could corrupt. One Saturday morning in April, I was filling my bird feeders when Tom Bradley walked over from his house. "Big news," he said, grinning. "Jennifer just told me the HOA received a national award." "An award? For what?" "For environmental stewardship and community engagement. That native plant initiative we have been working on caught the attention of some national HOA management organization. They are recognizing Meadowbrook as a model for sustainable community development." I laughed in disbelief. The same HOA that had fined me $500 for bird feeders was now winning awards for environmental initiatives. "That is incredible," I said. "Who would have thought?" "You made this happen, Ryan. You stood up when it mattered and you changed the whole community's direction." I shook my head. It was not just me. It was you calling the Audubon Society, Patricia retracting her complaint, Jennifer and the board being willing to change course. It took a lot of people doing the right thing. True, Tom agreed, but someone had to take that first stand. That was you. As he walked back to his house, I stood in my backyard, listening to the birds singing their morning chorus. A lazuli bunting landed on the feeder, its brilliant blue plumage catching the sunlight. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. The legal and financial aspects of the whole ordeal had finally wrapped up. Rachel Hoffman had negotiated a settlement where the HOA paid for my replacement bird feeders and covered a portion of my legal fees. It was not everything I had spent, especially considering my time and stress, but it felt like a fair resolution. More importantly, it established a clear precedent that the HOA could not arbitrarily restrict wildlife-friendly features without proper justification. The GoFundMe that strangers had started for my legal defense had raised enough money to cover most of my remaining expenses, with some left over that I donated to the Audubon Society's research programs. It felt right to give back to the organization that had helped me when I needed it most. In May, Dr. Chen invited me to present our research findings at a regional conservation symposium. This time, I felt more confident speaking in public. We presented together, with her handling the scientific details and me discussing the practical aspects of creating urban wildlife habitat despite institutional obstacles. The response was enthusiastic. Several municipalities sent representatives who were interested in updating their own ordinances to encourage wildlife-friendly residential landscaping. A few HOA board members from other communities approached me afterward, asking for advice on how to promote conservation initiatives without the kind of conflict I had experienced. The key is education, I told them. Most people do not object to bird-friendly landscaping when they understand the benefits. The problem is when decisions are made based on assumptions and aesthetics rather than facts. One of the most gratifying developments came in June, when Boulder County adopted new regulations that specifically protected native landscaping and wildlife habitat features in residential areas. The regulations included language that prohibited HOAs from restricting native plants or bird feeders unless there was documented evidence of actual problems, not just theoretical concerns. The county commissioner who sponsored the ordinance cited my case in her remarks. No homeowner should face punishment for supporting native wildlife and contributing to conservation efforts, she said at the public hearing. Our regulations should encourage this kind of environmental stewardship, not penalize it. The ordinance passed unanimously. Several environmental groups celebrated it as a major victory for residential conservation. I attended the hearing and felt a surge of pride knowing that my personal struggle had contributed to broader policy changes that would help other homeowners. My backyard had become something of a local attraction. The Audubon Society occasionally brought groups of students or interested citizens to see the monitoring setup and observe the birds. I always made time to talk with visitors, explaining what had motivated me to create the habitat and the challenges I had faced. One group that visited included several high school environmental science students. Their teacher had used my case as an example in her class about grassroots environmental action. The students asked thoughtful questions about HOA law, wildlife conservation, and how to balance individual property rights with community standards. What advice would you give to someone in a similar situation? One student asked. I thought about it for a moment. Document everything. Know your rights. Find experts who can support your position with facts and data, and be persistent. The easy thing would have been to just give up and pay the fine. But sometimes the right thing requires fighting battles you did not expect to fight. Another student asked if I would do it all again, knowing what I know now about the stress and expense involved. Absolutely, I replied without hesitation. This was never just about bird feeders. It was about standing up against unreasonable authority and protecting something I believed in. The fact that it led to broader changes and helped other people makes it even more worthwhile. As summer progressed, my involvement with the Audubon Society deepened. I joined their board of directors for the regional chapter, bringing a perspective as a volunteer and community advocate rather than a scientist. My role was to help bridge the gap between the organization's research mission and public engagement efforts. At one board meeting, we discussed expanding the urban wildlife monitoring program that had started at my property. Dr. Chen proposed creating a network of residential monitoring sites across the Denver-Boulder metropolitan area to track bird populations and habitat quality over time. We need homeowners who are willing to host equipment and participate in long-term research, she explained. Ryan's property has proven the concept. Now we want to scale it up. The board approved the initiative, and I volunteered to help recruit participants. Over the following months, we signed up 15 homeowners across the region who were creating bird-friendly habitats. Each property would host monitoring equipment and contribute data to the larger research project. It felt like my small act of resistance had sparked something bigger than I could have imagined. What started as one person refusing to back down to an unreasonable HOA demand had grown into a regional conservation initiative that would provide valuable scientific data for years to come. In August, I received an email from Derek Hammond, the lawyer who had represented the HOA during my initial dispute. I was surprised to hear from him, given how things had ended. Mr. Fitzgerald, his email began. I wanted to reach out personally to apologize for my role in the HOA's actions last year. I should have questioned Brenda Morrison's claims more carefully and investigated the facts before supporting her position. Your case taught me an important lesson about blind adherence to client wishes versus ethical representation. I have since stopped representing HOAs that engage in this kind of overreach. I wanted you to know that your principled stand made a difference, including in how I approach my own professional responsibilities. I was taken aback by the message. I had viewed Derek as an adversary, someone who enabled Brenda's behavior. But his email showed that he had reflected on his role and made changes. I wrote back thanking him for the apology and acknowledging that it took integrity to admit mistakes. The incident reminded me that the ripple effects of standing up for what is right can reach unexpected places and change people in ways you might never see. In September, exactly 1 year after Brenda Morrison's sentencing, the Meadowbrook HOA held a community celebration. The event was Jennifer Wang's idea, a way to mark the neighborhood's transformation and bring residents together in a positive way. The celebration took place in the common area near the neighborhood entrance. The board had used some of the HOA's funds to install a small native plant demonstration garden with educational signage about local wildlife. There was food, music, and activities for kids. Several local environmental organizations set up information tables, including the Audubon Society. I helped staff the Audubon table with Dr. Chen and Tom Bradley. We had displays showing the research findings from my property and the expanded monitoring network. Kids could use binoculars to look at bird identification charts, and we handed out seed packets for native wildflowers that people could plant in their own yards. Jennifer Wang gave a short speech thanking everyone who had contributed to the community's positive changes over the past year. She specifically mentioned the Environmental Committee's work and acknowledged that the transformation had started with one resident's willingness to challenge an unjust policy. We are stronger as a community when we listen to each other and remain open to changing course when we are wrong, Jennifer said. This past year has taught us that HOAs can be forces for positive change, not just enforcement mechanisms. We are proud of what Meadowbrook has become, and we are excited about where we are headed. As the sun set and families packed up to head home, I found myself talking with Patricia Lewis. She had become a good friend over the past year, someone I regularly swapped birding stories and native plant tips with. "You know what I realized," she said, watching kids chase each other around the new demonstration garden. "This whole thing could have gone so differently. If you had not fought back, if Jennifer had not been willing to stand up to Brenda, if people had not been open to new ideas, we could still be living under that oppressive regime." "I got lucky," I admitted. "I had Dr. Chen's support, a good lawyer, and neighbors like you and Tom who were willing to speak up. Not everyone has those advantages." "True, but you also made your own luck. You did the research, you built a strong case, you did not give up when it would have been easier to just comply." She paused, watching a chickadee land on a nearby branch. "You gave the rest of us permission to push back too. That matters." As I drove home that evening, I thought about how much my life had changed in less than 2 years. I had gone from a quiet software developer who mostly kept to himself to a community advocate, conservation volunteer, and public speaker. I had discovered strengths I did not know I had, and found a sense of purpose beyond my career. My backyard bird feeders, those simple devices that had sparked such controversy, were now surrounded by the infrastructure of ongoing scientific research. The cameras and monitors had become familiar fixtures, silently documenting the comings and goings of dozens of bird species. The data they collected would contribute to scientific understanding and conservation efforts for years to come. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, looking at my house. It was just a modest 3-bedroom home in a suburban neighborhood, nothing special by most standards. But it had become the center of something important, a small battlefield where principles had been tested and ultimately prevailed. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my kitchen window, watching the evening light fade. A few birds were making last visits to the feeders before nightfall. I recognized them all by now. The resident chickadees and nuthatches, the house finches that nested in my serviceberry bush, the juncos that would stay through the winter. These birds did not care about HOA politics or property rights disputes. They just needed food, water, shelter, and safe places to raise their young. By creating habitat for them, I was participating in something much older and more fundamental than human bureaucracies and regulations. That was what made this worth fighting for. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen. She was sending me a preview of her next research paper, which would feature multi-year data from my property and the expanded monitoring network. The findings showed measurable increases in bird species diversity in yards with native plants and feeding stations compared to conventional landscaping. "Your backyard continues to be our star research site," her message read. "Thank you for everything you do for science and conservation." I smiled and set my phone down. Tomorrow I would wake up, make my coffee, and spend a few minutes watching birds before starting my workday. It was a simple routine, but it connected me to something larger than myself. That connection was worth defending, worth fighting for, worth all the stress and expense of standing up to those who would take it away. As darkness settled over Meadowbrook, I thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with mine through this experience. Brenda Morrison, whose hunger for control had led to her downfall. Jennifer Wung, who had found her voice and transformed the HOA into something positive. Dr. Chen, who had seen the scientific value in a suburban backyard. Tom Bradley, who had been a steady ally and friend. Rachel Hoffman, who had fought skillfully for my rights. The neighbors who had spoken up, the students who had learned from my example, the policymakers who had crafted better regulations. All of these connections had formed because I refused to let someone take away my bird feeders. It seemed almost absurd when I thought about it that way. But that was how change happened sometimes, through small acts of resistance that snowballed into something bigger, touching lives and changing systems in ways that could never be fully predicted. I finished my wine and headed to bed, content with how things had turned out. The birds would return to the feeders tomorrow morning and the cycle would continue. The research would go on, generating data and insights. The community would keep evolving, hopefully maintaining the positive direction it had found. And I would keep doing my small part to support native wildlife and stand up for what I believed in, one bird feeder at a time.